language that seems to imply the woman in the elevator who behaves in ways that reveals a kind of racist attitude against categories of people. He'll call that racist behavior and distinguish it from the person being a racist. And in other cases, it's unclear that he makes that distinction, and it sounds like he's calling her out as essentially racist. And I'm not, and I don't think he intends that. And I don't think you should either. I think this is an important point, one that I've mentioned before. But if somebody says something or behaves in a way that's sexist or racist or homophobic or something like that, I think it's probably best for that conversation, to the extent that you want to have a conversation, it's best for that other person, to the extent that you're interested in the benefits of this other person in changing their worldview, if you don't call them out as sexist. Say, you're a sexist, you're a racist. Once you call somebody that, they're hearing you say, essentially you're a racist. That is you insofar as your identity. And once you call somebody out in that way, do you think you're going to get into a conversation with them about anything? No. I mean, imagine somebody tells you, you know what, to your core, essentially, you're a freaking horrible person. Let's talk about that now. So how about we discuss what I just said about you being essentially... Now, if it's David Duke, even if it's David Duke, who, again, Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, the bar is really high to get, or maybe it's low. I don't know which square it is, but probably that dude is essentially, to his core, he identifies with, and all his other being, his categorization of self, comes from that racism in a large way. Even then, give the person the benefit of the doubt and assume that what they just said or did was sexist, and they may not have realized it. It could have been an accident. And in that way, even if they are to their core, they're more likely to listen to what you have to say. And I think Yancy kind of goes back and forth on that. But he clearly is pointing out the way that Roeder and Kelly do with respect to implicit biases, that it's not the case that all of these prejudices and these acts upon which we engage in the spaces of the quotidian, as he says it, in spaces like the elevators, in stores, walking down the street and he hears people locking their doors. Keep in mind, he's not referencing single events. It isn't once that this happened to him in an elevator. It's not as if it's only happened to him and he hasn't spoken to other people who've had similar situations who are like him. It's not a one-off thing. If it were a one-off thing, then indeed it would be rather quick to say, this is probably due to implicit biases and systemic racism. That would be too quick. It's a multitude of experiences. It is cumulative. It is, some cases, daily, walking down the street, even though he's well-dressed, coat and tie, that is ignored as he's seen already as guilty, as people lock their doors, already as dangerous, as people clutch their purses and so forth. Even if they're not doing, and this is the moral dilemma, even if they're not doing it consciously, and even if you ask that lady in the elevator, for example, as Yancy considers, what if I had just confronted her? He considers this thought experiment toward the end of that long paper, something we'll return to when we look at Maria Lugones in her World Traveling, which is a kind of a sense of traveling to other people's perspectives. And there's more to it than that, as we'll see. But in what way should she be held morally responsible for these actions? Can she control them? Is she even aware of them? Is it automatically triggered in a way that she couldn't stop? Is it kind of like texting in class where you can't control it? It's an impulse that's biological, and therefore you can't be held responsible for it because nobody can control whether they text in class because it's so difficult to stop yourself from texting in class. No, that is controllable. And it's a moral wrong on par with the Holocaust. Just kidding. It's Holocaust and then texting. A little bit below it. I can see when you're doing it. So, that's a bit of an aside. Somewhat relevant. You could imagine he would ask of this woman, do you believe that I'm dangerous? Do you believe that I'm inferior to you? Do you believe that I'm guilty of is there criminality by virtue of me belonging to this category? Probably today most people are going to say, no, I don't believe that. But you're acting as if you did. And there's again that concept of a-leaf. And Yancy's aware of this. He doesn't talk about a-leafs. That's a term that's coined. Actually, she may have coined that term, Tamar Gendler, around 2008 as well, but I don't think Yancy's not aware of that phrase. And I don't think he would agree with it applied here anyway, for the reasons we mentioned before, because that sounds like it's biological. And I don't know that I can be held responsible for something that's purely biological in reaction to a given stimulus. As he points out, there are those who could be described as goodwill whites, as he puts it, who deny holding racist beliefs and yet still benefit from being a particular way. As the phrase I mentioned last time, being whitely in the world, it's a kind of physical comportment, how I carry myself. Am I responsible for that? Think again of my example, or the examples in the Roeder Kelly text, Yancy's elevator example, but also my example with the pickup trucks. Is it morally reprehensible behavior to engage in road rage? Being whitely in the world, the analogy here is being road ragey in the world. Anger is fine if somebody legitimately does something wrong. But if somebody swerves into a lane in front of you without putting their signal on, does that justify engaging in road rage? How many have road rage? Raise your hand. Wow. I thought it'd be more since this is California. Thank you for your honesty. How many have punched the ceiling of their own car to get at the bastard who might have cut you off? You don't have to answer that, but thank you. I appreciate it. It doesn't do much good. You hurt yourself, you damage your car. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and yet it happens. It doesn't happen consciously. You're not consciously saying to yourself, I'll just show that son of a bitch and I'm just going to hit my own car. And I'm going to keep hitting my own car in anger because it's justifiable. It's automatically triggered. You're not fully aware of it, too. And I feel that, that's what it is. It's more of a feeling. I feel that the guy's a jackass. And I don't even notice. I tense up. I act differently. My wife notices these things. But if she asks me, or if anyone asks me, do you believe that all pickup truck drivers are jackasses? First of all, the word jackass is vague. We talked about that. But clearly I would not believe that. I'm not going to assent to that. I don't consciously endorse the belief that all pickup truck drivers are jackasses. But I sure do act as if it were true. Am I responsible for this action? In other words, could I be aware of my bodily comportment, the way I'm behaving? Especially if I have kids in the car. Do you see where I'm going with this? And as Yancy says toward the end of the reading, but he or she ought to have been aware. And where he or she ought to have been aware, here he's borrowing from Immanuel Kant, ought implies can. He or she can indeed be aware. I wasn't aware that there was implicit bias. I wasn't aware that I was acting in a particular way that would negatively influence other people around me. Is that kind of unawareness? Yeah. Morally exculpatory today. That is, are you off the hook for not realizing how you're behaving or how implicit bias works today? That's part of the question.
So, if you get upset by road rage, you're choosing to have road rage?
That's good. That's good. I don't know. How many want to have road rage? I don't know if I asked that.
Because if you can...
It feels good sometimes.
If you can be aware of it, then you can choose whether to be upset or not.
If you can't... No, that's a great question. If I'm totally unaware of something, let me give the example. Remember a 5-year-old kid who's unaware of alternative hypotheses to Santa Claus. Does Santa Claus exist? Let's say I'm 5. Well, yeah. What's the evidence, kid? Says, my parents told me. And my parents don't lie. They're trustworthy. And my siblings, my older sister told me. And my friends have told me. And I saw it on the news. The meteorologist talked about Santa Claus. And I saw Santa Claus at the mall. And this 5-year-old has not had any counter evidence because his family has sheltered him and lied to him continually and consistently. It's not irrational of that 8-year-old boy to not know. And therefore that ignorance is exculpatory in the moral and legal sense, that term exculpatory. They're not guilty because they couldn't know otherwise. We wouldn't put it on them as far as a burden. But if I'm driving down the freeway at 100 miles an hour and I get pulled over and said, you know how fast you're going, sir? And I'd say, no, my eyes were closed. I have no idea. And I also don't know what the speed limit was because, again, my eyes were closed. That's not acceptable ignorance. That's called willful blindness. And Yancy will use that phrase elsewhere. Sometimes it's called, and Maria Lagonis next time, or in a week, we'll look at her reading. She'll call it aggressive ignorance, which is a fantastic phrase. Aggressive ignorance. It's a kind of willful non-seeing to make us feel better about not being more consciously aware of how we comport ourselves. Go ahead.
I was going to say, is he kind of going at this in the sense where he has this like form of double consciousness and
Right.
awareness, where he's kind of saying like, you ought to be aware of it because if he has this ability to have this kind of form of double consciousness from his like color of his skin, would like white people not be able to have the same thing? Is that kind of,
That's a great question.
does he imply that at all, or is it kind of?
At the very end of the reading, he does talk about how, to the extent that one is responsible, one has to be aware of what they're doing, and it has to be controllable. If I could not, go back to the example of the child, it's obvious that the child is ignorant, and we wouldn't blame the child for that ignorance. But can we be blameless with respect to contemporary society when our previous president has come out explicitly stating, before I was senator, Barack Obama, was profiled multiple times. Oprah talks about this, and when Oprah talks about it, people listen. People have heard it. It's not new, I guess you'd say. Then we get to the question of, and here's what I want you to think about insofar as the group work now, are there analogous cases? This is the most common form of reasoning in moral thinking, is to say, look, here's a case in which we're unsure. And this is the quiz, basically. I'm going to have you break into groups, and I'll do that in a moment. But this is what I want you to answer. And this has kind of been in the background of the last couple of lectures anyway, so it's not new. Consider the examples of Yancy in the elevator, or those presented by Roeder and Kelly, or others, if you have your own examples, or me with pickup truck drivers and so forth. Should you be held responsible for behaviors that come about through stereotypes, but that are non-conscious or implicit, right? Non-conscious or implicit, automatic, they're triggered, so to speak. The environments, if I see something dangerous like a snake or a bear or the glass enclosure and I'm frightened of heights, like babies are afraid of heights. They've studied this where they have the mom over there and they have the glass enclosure here and the baby will want to crawl to the mom but is scared and won't cross the glass enclosure. It's kind of awful. And so the babies are inherently frightened. Are implicit social biases like that? Or are they different? That's part of this question. And then consciously unendorsed. Got to know what consciously unendorsed means. Think of me with think of the A-leaf example as well. And I want you to be able to briefly explain each of these. So the main question is, give an argument that you are or that you are not morally responsible. And one of the best ways of doing it, I'll get your hand in a second, is to look at examples that have that. And we'd say, if you want to make the case that we're not responsible, well then look for examples that have those features, automatic, implicit, consciously unendorsed beliefs, that one would say you're not guilty for. You're not morally flawed. And therefore you shouldn't be held morally responsible for implicit biases that are of that sort. On the other hand, if you want to say, no, we are responsible, come up with examples in which those features are found, and it's clear that you should be held morally responsible for them. And to the extent that it's analogous case to issues of implicit bias, then that argument should go through, that you're responsible. Yes?
Would it still be an implicit bias, like just to draw an analogy to something? Like say I'd been hit by a red Corvette 15 times, all different ones. And so now when I see one, I won't even cross the street even if I like the right of way.
That's an interesting
question. Would that be an implicit
question.
bias still, or would that just be from experience?
Very good question.
Yeah, if he's like experienced.
You have a
Deal with that, and it happens to be
You-
a situation where it could be considered racist.
Okay.
Not likely to.
Yancey discusses this because one of the responses to the elevator thought experiment, and this is actually part of one of your questions for the study guide for the test, is he is it acceptable for him to assume systemic racism as a cause of her reactions? Or could it be that she was, and here's one of the questions, she was sexually assaulted? And it's not the color of his skin, it's his maleness that she's afraid of, or something like that. The other case was maybe she's blind or something. There's a bunch of other alternatives. And part of that question is he justified in making that claim? That goes back to our discussion of epistemic privilege and his double consciousness and the cumulative effects of multiple instances of having this happen to him. And there's a parallel, though, to what you're saying. If I have had numerous cases, well, there is a parallel, of pickup trucks. I've seen a lot of them drive like jackasses. A lot. Tons. But enough to justify the stereotype that they're all. But I see your point, though.
But I think maybe, because even though most of them probably do drive nicely, you still have like worse experiences with more pickup truck drivers than other drivers.
Remember confirmation bias. Remember my other example of a Geo Metro cutting me off. Did I give you that one? My wife looked at me, astonished that I wasn't enraged, because I really did get cut off. And she explained to me what happened, and I didn't even notice it. And I didn't care, because it didn't meet my expectations of those kinds of cars being jackasses, or the drivers. And so I ignored it. And I think that's part of what goes into stereotypes. If indeed you've been hit 15 times by a red Corvette, you're looking for trouble with the red Corvettes. I don't know what to say about that. Nevertheless, that's potentially maybe a counterexample to Roeder and Kelly. Maybe that'll come up in your group discussions. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, it also goes the opposite way. That Yancy had actually said this in his, that he would believe these were implicit reactions to his color and his skin and stuff because he had seen it so much. He had had this happen to him so many times.
Right.
He had heard of people that had had this happen. That it kind of goes both ways on that one, where she may be thinking, I've been attacked by...
I see.
I've been hit by the red Corvette 13 times. The Corvettes might be going...
Yeah, right.
The city has been going in front of my Corvette so many times, I should be worried about him.
I see.
So,
Yeah, that'll come up, I imagine, in the discussion. That's a tough one. That's a good point. Where was the other hand? Did I see another hand?
It doesn't have to be all in order for a bad experience to...
No.
Like even if you stayed for example, you stayed at a hotel and it was a bad experience, like that could only happen once, and then
Right.
you never want to stay at that hotel.
And then you even post something.
Yeah,
Worst hotel ever.
Right.
Never go there.
One singular...
The problem with stereotypes is sometimes that's how they work. It's usually not built up by personal experience. The kinds that he's talking about are systemic, and there's one distinction, I guess. Yancy might reply. There's a difference between personal stereotypes, which is the case for me in pickup trucks. I don't think that's a culturally infused stereotype. I don't think. But there are culturally infused stereotypes about, as we saw with Yancy and Mills, not John Stuart Mills, but Charles Mills, which was suggested reading, that there is a history of these particular racial stereotypes that are part of the culture, that are shared beliefs, whether we endorse them or not, in a sense. That's different than my cultural bias against red Corvettes because of personal experience. I think that's a little bit different, though. Yeah, and then...
I think if you act on confirmation bias, you can't be held responsible because that is an automatic process.
That would be part of the reasoning.
Okay,
So I wouldn't be responsible for my confirmation bias.
So that's happened to you, so you think that all truck drivers are jackasses.
Yep.
So when a truck driver cuts you off, that's confirming the belief that you already have.
But remember...
And that happens subconsciously, so you can't control, like the red Corvette. If he sees one, he's like, okay, that's going to hit me because it's already happened.
So many times.
My belief is already made up that red Corvette's
Good.
hit me if I cross the street.
That'll help address
But that's
this
happening
response.
subconsciously, so you can't
You can't control beliefs that you're not fully conscious
You
of.
can't stop being afraid. Yeah, you can't teach yourself to not be afraid.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you can, but it's very hard.
You can't decide not to confirm your belief if that is already explained.
If you can't decide to avoid confirmation bias, well, then we're in trouble in science in particular. Because science is not going to work if we cannot avoid confirmation bias. And scientists come up with all sorts of mechanisms to help avoid those confirmation biases. Now, this doesn't discount your claim. But you might want to think about, well, since we're aware that there are such things as confirmation biases, are there things that we can do to mitigate them? And if we're aware that they happen, go back to Yancy's point here, are there things that we should be doing to make ourselves more aware of them and therefore alleviate them? I'm going to actually make a couple of arguments next time addressing this answer, but I'm curious to what your responses are. Real quick question, last one.
Could you also argue if you are not conscious of it, you are not responsible for it, but as soon as it becomes aware to you, then it becomes your responsibility. And if you continue to act in the way that you have been, it becomes morally wrong because you're aware of it. But the initial thing of it, but if you brought it to attention and she was like, oh, and kind of noticed,
I don't know.
then
I don't
it'd be
know.
different.
So me driving 100 miles an hour, blind, not looking. And there's a speed limit sign coming up, and I go like this, just drive right past it.
Probably.
I don't know. I stay ignorant. What's the speed limit? I have no idea. I really don't know. So you choose to go 100? Could be 100. Is this the Autobahn? No idea. I'm just totally blind driving on. I think that's an exaggerated point, but it's simply to make the distinction between willful ignorance and, let's call it, exculpate, mitigating ignorance. You're not guilty for not knowing it. But I don't want to answer any more of those because I want you guys to think about this. I'm going to break you into six groups. This room is not designed well for anything but watching films, I guess. But so I'm sorry about that. Please remember your numbers. You'll be in the groups.